The history of the first two Darkstalkers games is kind of an interesting one. You see, Capcom wanted to make a new fighting game based on their Street Fighter II engine and wanted to incorporate the Universal monsters in it. So, you know, I'm talking about Frankenstein, Dracula, Wolfman, etc. Sadly for Capcom, they didn't actually get the rights from Universal, so they were forced to tweak the characters, and pretty much, voila, Darkstalkers was born. The original game was released on the CPS2 arcade board back in 1994, with a home release planned for Sega's upcoming 32X hardware. Sadly, those plans fell through, and the game would lie dormant for quite a while. With both Sony and Sega's next-gen systems entering the market in 1995, both Sony and Sega showed interest in having an exclusive fighting game. The catch is that by this point in time, Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, which was the sequel to the original Darkstalkers, had already been released in arcades. Now, I don't know the full details of how exactly Sony and Sega managed to capture the exclusive rights to the games they did, but at the end of the day, Sony ended up with Darkstalkers The Night Warriors, and Sega with the follow-up Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge. Sony's exclusive would ship first in March of 1996, with Sega's following up in April of the same year. So if you had both systems, you pretty much were all set. Okay, with that history lesson out of the way, let's jump on into the actual game itself. Now, since we're talking about a sequel here today, I think it's only fair that I go over some of the basics from the first game. The first Darkstalkers featured 10 playable characters and featured 2 boss characters players would go up against in the story mode, or what I consider the single-player arcade mode. The gameplay was pretty much exactly the same as Super Street Fighter II Turbo, except that in Darkstalkers you could crouch walk and air block. The special meter from Super Turbo was also featured, which allowed you to perform more powerful versions of your special moves or a super combo move. The difference was, unlike in Super Turbo, you couldn't store stock until later on in the match. So once the meter was full, you were pretty much pressured to use it ASAP or lose it. Outside that though, the gameplay was extremely similar to Super Turbo, just with all new characters, backgrounds, etc. So a lot of people called it a Street Fighter clone, and I have a feeling that could be one of the reasons why it never really took off. The sequel, Night Warriors Darkstalkers Revenge, or Darkstalkers 2 as I call it, featured mostly similar gameplay, except there was more of an emphasis on combos this time around. There was also a normal or auto block configuration players could select. The biggest difference though, well, outside of the roster change-up, which now featured 12 playable characters, was the ability to store and keep stock. This allowed players to perform super combos or super moves whenever they wanted, which dramatically altered the gameplay compared to the original game. This one was also a much larger game compared to the first one. This one was almost twice the size of the original Darkstalkers, which allowed for far more detailed frames of animation and also much better looking backgrounds. Personally, I was always a very big fan of this game. I never saw the original Darkstalkers in the arcades, and truth be told, I actually don't know if the original Darkstalkers was ever even released in North America. But this one most certainly was, as I remember it well. I had an absolute blast with it back in the day with my friends in the arcades. This is a fantastic fighting game that any SEGA Saturn fan should have in their collection. Like all Capcom games released on the Saturn, it's getting a little bit hard to find today, but thankfully it's one of the cheaper games and only fetches around $35 or so. Hell, you could buy a brand new one for $50 if you're interested. I highly recommend you all go out there and snag a copy before prices start to skyrocket or it just becomes impossible to find. You won't be disappointed.